screen. All right, and then I'll put this in presentation mode. Welcome, everybody. All right, I changed the title slightly to say perhaps we need to shift the focus away from binary thinking of statistical significance towards education. And we often start every presentations we do virtually with a land acknowledgement here in Canada. This is really a process where we actually acknowledge the land where we offer care or we learn or we do research. This is a commitment of the Canadian system to reconciliation with our Aboriginal peoples. So here at St. Joseph's Hamilton, we recognize lands on which we provide care, which is the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee peoples. And for thousands of years, the first people sought to steward the precious resources and share this land with others. These territories were subject of the dish with one spoon, one pan belt covenant. And the dish represents the shared land, while one spoon reinforces the idea of peacefully sharing and caring for the lands around the Great Lakes in the spirit of mutual cooperation. At St. Joseph's Hamilton, which is really where McMaster is, we pledge to continue to work together with the Indigenous peoples in building a more just society where their gifts and those of all other people are nurtured and honored. This was a paper that was published just before COVID. This was 2019. I'll come back to that paper as we go through the discussion. What do I hope to share with you today? First, the connection between statistical thinking and evidence-based practice. And then perhaps talk about the history of statistical significance. There's quite a bit of practical challenges we face in practice about statistical significance. I'll touch on those. And perhaps the ongoing debate about how to deal with all these challenges. And then I'll make some suggestions about really how to perhaps think about shifting the way we think about the binary nature of statistical significance as we apply it in practice. And then I'll end it with some concluding remarks, essentially about why you as a scientist should care about all these issues. This is George Wells. Many people think of him as the father of science fiction. George Wells was actually born in England. He was a novelist, a teacher, and a historian, but most importantly, he was also a journalist. And he's done a lot of notable works, but in statistics, we know him for making one of the most audacious predictions. Quote, statistical thinking will someday be necessary for efficient citizenship as the ability to read and write. We all know that one of the most fundamental qualities of any citizens or abilities is being able to read and write. And he predicted that someday statistical thinking will be as equally important to becoming a good citizen. So what is statistical thinking? Quite often when we see information or evidence, we can look at the evidence, we can describe what we are observing, we can look at the central features of the evidence, we can look at the spread of the evidence, and so on, and many other characteristics by just looking at the distribution of the evidence. We often would wonder, how the evidence came about, what inferences we can make about it, the populations that may have generated this, or the mechanism that have generated the evidence. And then we worry about the context. Is it of good quality? Is it relevant? Could there be other explanations? And then we tend to expect certain things and we benchmark what we are seeing and how we're evaluating this evidence against what perhaps we may have expected through hypotheses and so on. So essentially, yes, we encounter any form of information and evidence in practice. This is how we go about trying to synthesize or get meaning out of it. And you may not actually have thought of this as statistical thinking, but essentially this is how statistical thinking process entails. And this is how we actually even teach statistical thinking in graduate education. So essentially statistical thinking in health is about advancing the welfare and the health of the society through research, which is really optimal use of information, whether we are using it to plan, diagnose, prevent, treat, or manage health conditions. So if you think about statistical thinking from that perspective, you can see now it is no different from the way we actually use evidence to actually make decisions. And therefore, one could say it's no different from evidence-based thinking. Perhaps with the arrival of COVID, it became true that statistical thinking indeed is evidence-based thinking, because every nation and every country, everybody was actually expected to become a good citizen in our fight against this pandemic. And therefore, statistical thinking became an ingredient element of becoming an efficient citizen. Every citizen around the world was expected to understand what it means to flatten the curve, because whether you had gone to school, whether you had gone to graduate school or not, whether you're a researcher or you're not a researcher, for us to protect ourselves against the virus, everybody had to behave in a particular way for us to be able to flatten the curve or even bend the curve. So all this information was everywhere for everybody to understand what it means and how to behave to achieve this bending of curve or flattening the curve. There was information about the utility of masks, why one should wear a mask, what happens when you wear a mask, what happens when you don't wear a mask. And all this information was disseminated in different forums, and people were expected to be able to understand what it means so they could behave appropriately. And this was all because everybody had to consume information in ways that would help perhaps to protect ourselves as a species against the virus. So suddenly understanding statistics became a necessary part of advancing our own welfare and protecting ourselves from the virus and perhaps our survival as a species. However, one would argue that you cannot really appreciate the clinical relevance of any evidence unless we adopt statistical thinking in how we collect that evidence, how we synthesize it, and how we interpret it. And I'll cover a lot of these issues as we go through. One would argue that, in almost everything we need, we need pragmatic trial evidence to guide what we do. There's lots of evidence showing that many of the things we do in practice, really, while they have strong evidence to back them under very ideal conditions, there's very little to guide how they should be used in practice in routine settings, simply because we don't have enough pragmatic evidence. There's lots of barriers we encounter even taking what we know to work best and putting it into practice. There's barriers in how we design things, how we actually approach implementation of studies, how we actually do the analysis, how we report things, and certainly most importantly, how we disseminate that information, including how we actually then communicate it to other people. There's lots of issues related to spinning of information, which sometimes makes it a lot harder for people to see what's happening. Let me step back a little bit and talk about the beginnings of p-value. You'll see how all these things come together and how the p-value becomes part of the problem. This is R.A. Fisher. Most people think of him as the father of modern statistics. Some have even described him as a genius who almost single-handedly created the foundations of modern statistical science. Let me remind you that many of the founding fathers of statistics were not themselves statisticians. This is Reverend Thomas Bayes, who was a pastor, and statistics was a hobby for him. And Fisher was really not a statistician, even though a lot of what we do in statistics can actually be attributed to him. He was a geneticist, and statistics for him was a tool for solving many of the problems we had. And some of his mentors, like Carl Pearson, he was a lawyer and a mathematician. So if you really look at the history of statistics, many of the founding fathers were not statisticians themselves. And I know in practice, some of the people who have some of the best statistical minds are not trained as a statisticians, they're actually clinicians. R.A. Fisher was actually born in England. He moved to Australia, and he was influenced by many other people, among whom Carl Pearson was his mentor. Perhaps among all the works he's done, he wrote a book which he called Statistical Methods for Research Workers. And in that book, he actually began to introduce the concept of statistical significance. And he wrote that the value for which t is equal to 0.05 or 1 in 20 is perhaps it is convenient to take this as a point, as a limit in judging whether a deviation is to be considered significant or not. So this was the beginning of the use of the term significant in science. And Fisher actually went on to advocate that we could use it as a standard level for concluding that there's evidence against the null hypothesis being tested. But he didn't warn people that this should not be taken as an absolute rule. In fact, he went on to actually say around the spectrum where a p-value could be defined, which is between 0 and 1, if p is between 0.1 and 0.9, there's certainly no reason to suspect the hypothesis being tested. If it's between 0.02, below 0.02, it is strongly indicated that the hypothesis fails to account for the whole of the facts. We shall not often be astray if we draw a conventional line at 0.05. So he really covered the entire spectrum instead of a single one, but somehow people focused on the 0.05 and the use of the term significance that came along with it. So the alpha of 0.05 was then introduced in statistical science as a criterion for judging statistical significance. And this has pretty much become ritualistic in how we actually approach science today. Many people have come and accused the practice and blamed others for that. And this is Stuart Pocock, one of our colleagues in the UK, who had written that the accept-reject philosophy of significance testing based on the magical 0.05 remains a dominant barrier in the minds of many non-statisticians. And to be honest, I would actually say the blame goes far beyond just non-statisticians. And the reason being, statisticians and non-statisticians work together. In fact, non-statisticians are taught and collaborate with statisticians. And so we're equally to blame in the practice of how p-values are used. So what are the practical challenges of statistical significance or p-value thresholds as we know them? Number one, there's overwhelming evidence showing that many of the published articles report p-values less than 0.05. And John Ioannidis showed in his work that it's well over 90% of published literature that shows p-values that are very small. However, you also highlight that many of these claims, they show nothing else but the possibility of false positives. So you can see how problematic this issue is, where the majority of literature shows statistically significant findings. What happens to those that are not statistically significant? The other problem is lack of statistical significance is often interpreted as absence of evidence. And Doug Altman and Martin Bland have actually warned people that absence of evidence is not the same thing as evidence of absence. And the reason is very simple. Many underpowered studies will often yield results that are not statistically significant, even though they may still have some clinical importance attached to them. This is a good example of a study that was looking at whether, if you continue a double therapy for people with heart problems versus discontinuing, could this do more harm than good? And the study actually showed a very significant result. There was a non-significant result because the p-value was not significant. But if you look at the result closely, there was about 7.5 relative risk difference between the two groups, which people would argue that this may actually be clinically important. However, you don't see statistical significance because the sample size are too small, and therefore you have fewer events which limit the statistical power to be able to see significance. But this issue would only be problematic if it's a common issue for us to see results that are not significant but clinically meaningful. So you may ask yourself, how common is this issue? This was a study looking at what's happening in cardiovascular trials. And they were trying to figure out, is there evidence that lots of studies in cardiovascular area produce results that are not statistically significant, but have the potential to be clinically meaningful? They found 127 cardiovascular trials, And of this, 72%, which is 92, were not statistically significant. Of the 92 that were not statistically significant, 61% actually had point estimates that included the minimum clinically important difference in the confidence interval. So you can see that this is really not a small issue. The prevalence is incredibly high. Cardiovascular trials is not the only area where this common phenomenon exists. It exists in many other clinical areas. I know it exists in critical care and definitely in many other areas of clinical care. That's why most reporting guidelines actually recommend justifying the sample size to avoid the risk of being able to miss important effects when they exist. If you look at the Spirit guideline, they do recommend this in a list of their items. If you look at the console, the trend, and the stroke, they also want to know, how the sample size was determined. Put that against false negatives. In short, p-values of underpowered trials are difficult to interpret. And actually, Tom Fleming, who's a colleague Seattle, actually always warned people that, the important insight is that p-values is interpretable only if you understand the sampling context, including how that information was actually determined in the first place. And it can also go the other way, where you have underpowered studies, which will always lead to statistical significant, overpowered studies, which lead to statistical significant findings, but the effect are so small that they have of no clinical importance. This was another study which showed highly significant result of a p-value that's very, very small. And if you look at the absolute risk reduction, it's about 2%. Right? And 2% people would argue that this may not be clinically important. However, the p-value is very, very small because you have very, very large sample sizes, which leads to the trial that is absolutely overpowered. This is Mike Walsh, one of our colleagues here at McMaster. A few years ago, he was one of our trainees, and he also talked about the concept of trial fragility, and he introduced the concept of fragility index. If you think of a trial where you're trying to compare two treatments A and B, and you actually do the analysis, trying to see whether is there a difference in the event rates between the two trials, two treatments, you find, yes, there is the p-value is significant, less than 0.05. If you move the patients from the intervention arm from non-event to event until you reverse statistical significance, the number of patients you have to move from non-event to event, we often actually think of that as the fragility index of a trial. In other words, if I have to take more patients to reverse statistical significance, we say the trial is less fragile. But if it takes a small number of patients to reverse that statistical significance, then we say the trial is highly fragile. So we looked at this for, various other trials in different disciplines, and this was actually done in anesthesiology trials. This was done in orthopedic trials, spine surgery, emergency medicine, stroke. This was another one in stroke. This was ophthalmology. All show that trials in these areas are incredibly fragile. What does that mean? It takes a very small number of patients to reverse statistical significance, right? In fact, one of my former trainees looked at this issue across all disciplines. And actually, the average fragility index was just 4. In other words, on average, it took only 4 patients to reverse the statistical significance that has been observed in many of the trials in these areas. Now, we rely on p-values, but they're incredibly difficult for people to understand. They're routinely misinterpreted. We have lots of examples of statements claiming no effect or no difference, which are really not appropriate, and some are poorly stated. So people really find it hard to understand the concept of p-values, and yet we continue to rely on it. The other thing is reliance on statistical significance promotes unethical practices in the way people conduct science, perhaps through what we call p-hacking. And there's evidence showing that p-hacking is widespread in the literature, particularly in the medical sciences or in health sciences in general. You might wonder, what is it? If we collect data or select data or perform statistical analysis until a result that is not statistically significant becomes significant, then this process or this behavior is called p-hacking. You can do it in so many ways. You can collect more data until you get significance. You can analyze lots of data, but report only those that are significant. You can select variables until you get significance. You can exclude patients until you get significance. And if none of these things really work, you can get a statistician to transform the data for you until you get significance. There's various ways you could actually get this done. The unfortunate reality is that people who tend to engage in this behavior, they're really never transparent about what they did. And therefore, it makes it a lot harder for us to replicate or reproduce what people did. And we all know science is based on replication. We do something in one patient, we replicate it in several patients, we call that a study. But we know that a single study is not good enough. We need to replicate the study in other settings to see whether the evidence is consistent. Number 7, the desire for significant findings is partly responsible for the research misconduct that often leads to a retraction of published papers. And in fact, if you look at reasons why papers get restricted, you'll often find that it's because people were fabricating data, those other behaviors, and quite often there would be results that were found to be significant, and people got too excited, and journals got too excited because you'll hype their citation indices and so on. P-values are often the main cause of publication bias. In fact, the whole concept of publication bias is defined by the propensity of journals to accept only studies or papers that show significant findings and not publish the ones that are not significant findings. So we would even have the publication bias issue if it wasn't because of the role of p-values. That's why I started looking at publication bias in Cochrane reviews, and what they found was there's lots of evidence of publication bias in these reviews. Now think of it, Cochrane system is supposed to be the highest gold standard for doing unbiased systematic reviews, but if they have publication bias, what more of reviews done by other systems and so on. And we do rely on the systematic reviews for the basis for guidelines that we often describe as evidence-based. So you can imagine, if we can't trust the Cochrane, what more of the other types of reviews that fit into guidelines? Number 9 is that we often have significant findings being overrepresented in the abstracts and press releases of published research. And quite often this becomes a problem when you have things that are not being reported, but you only have a significant p-value being overstated in the abstract and so on. This phenomenon is quite prevalent. And it's a problem behind what we call spin. That even when people had focused on certain things as primary focus, and they don't get significance, they get significance on secondary things, they focus the messaging on the secondary things because that's where they have significance. And that's what you will see in the abstract. And I'll demonstrate with an example later on. To be honest, p-values have all sorts of problems. This is Frank Harrell, who is really documented a whole list of potential problems, which could be conceptual, indirectness of p-values, multiplicity issues, and difficult with interpretation. So on. I encourage you to actually have a look at his website because he has a whole litany of problems with p-values. Frankly, reliance on p-values has more challenges than I have the time to elucidate in a 1-hour presentation. So I'm going to move on and perhaps talk about what's going on, about what to do with them, because these issues are not new. They've been there for many years, and we've always recognized all these challenges. So in 2016, the American Statistical Association, in recognition of all these challenges, released a statement and trying to warn people against misuse of statistical significance of p-values. And the statement has 6 principles in it. The first one being they were warning people that p-value only indicate how compatible the data are with a statistical hypothesis or a model. They should definitely not be used to measure the probability that a studied hypothesis is true, even though quite often people interpret them as such. And therefore, decisions should not be based on whether a p-value is above or below some threshold. Rather, people should provide full reporting of what the estimate of the effects are and how precise those estimates are, including any other additional information that would help people with better interpretation of the findings. And they remind people that p-values do not measure the size of the effect, and therefore they don't provide a good measure of evidence for or against any hypothesis. So they certainly were warning people about misuse or overuse of p-values. 2 years later, there was another group looking at the same issue, realizing that despite the warning from the American Statistical Association, somehow behavior and practice was not changing, right? So another group recommended perhaps we should move the threshold from 0.05 to 0.005. The smaller the threshold, the less likely that perhaps this will create a problem. John Ioannidis, who's also dedicated his career in trying to make sure that science is reproducible, because that's what we depend on. He wrote an editorial for JAMA saying that perhaps this is something that is worth advocating for or considering. I'll come back to his editorial later on as we go back to this issue. However, about the same time, there was a note of caution that came out that, well, this recommendation of changing the threshold and making it a little smaller, it may certainly reduce the false positive conclusions because it will reduce the number of studies that become statistically significant. However, the simulation showed that it had the propensity to increase overestimation of effects. So certainly this was not going to be a panacea. Just before COVID, there was another group of statisticians that were also looking at this, assembled again by the American Statistical Association to figure out how to come up with something that perhaps would be a lot more practical. And they actually dedicated the entire edition of one of their journals to this issue. They call it the Statistical Inference in the 21st Century, a world beyond p less than 0.05. And in the editorial of that piece, the editors actually provided a caution that people should stop saying something is statistically significant when they report science, right? And before COVID, when I used to give this presentation live, I would actually ask people in the room, how many of you are willing never to use the phrase, this is statistically significant in your writing? I've never seen any single person raise their hand. So it would be interesting to see whether any of you would be willing to actually never say something is statistically significant. About the same time this came out, they said, well, people are not willing to change. Perhaps we should retire the whole thing, right? And there were over 100 signatories to this call of people saying it's about time to retire statistical significance. Let's get rid of it, right? It created a lot of debate and editorials in different areas of science. There were debates on both sides of the story. Others hailed it as a sensible, practical thing to do. And others actually pushed back and say, hey, hang on a minute. If we do that, we are now giving bias a free pass. This was John Ioannidis. And his argument was simple. When something is statistically significant, we pay attention to it. We look at the methods and we see where the sources of bias are that may have led to the statistical significance. If we are now not even going to say something is significant, then that scrutiny will disappear. Colin Beck actually agreed that the problem is really not p-values, it's human behavior. How can we get scientists to behave better? And perhaps academic institutions should also stop fueling this inappropriate behavior because institutions, glorify scientists who get to be in the media because they have significant findings, and journals are also the same thing, and so is the press. So he said the issue is not p-values, perhaps human behavior that comes in all spheres of science that we should be dealing with. To be honest, it's unlikely that practice will change anytime soon, though. I would argue that the problem is the entire academic system, right? There was empirical evidence showing that, guess what? If you ban p-values, there's a journal that actually introduced a policy of banning p-values. Somebody will find something else to abuse, right? As I thought nothing would change, the New England Journal of Medicine actually came out and said they're changing their author guidelines in response to all this debate. And I looked at what the change was, and the change was, you know what? If you have a situation where the data analysis plan is not included and adjustments for multiple testing is also not described. P-values should be replaced with point estimates and confidence intervals. They should not be reported, right? Frankly, that didn't look much like a major change to me. I think the entire overall system needs to be overhauled. The issue is whether we, as part of the system, are willing enough to actually overhaul the entire academic culture. And, Colin actually said, for us to be able to succeed, we need to really figure out whether we need to change how we reward, academic success, and perhaps how we celebrate it, which, he argues that's part of what's fueling this behavior. Well, this issue is not new. There has been some suggestions of what to do in the interim while we figure out how to change academic culture, because it takes time to change academic institutions. That perhaps the most slowpoke type of institutions to change. In 1996, the concept statement was published, and this was in the effort to try and provide transparency in reporting of trials so that people can actually synthesize the evidence better to inform guidelines as part of the movement for evidence-based medicine. And if you look at the concept checklist, there's nowhere where there's a recommendation of reporting for p-values. We talk about reporting confidence intervals instead. P-values are not mentioned. It has been extended to all different types of outcomes, different types of interventions, and different types of designs, and all of them don't talk about reporting of p-values. We extended this to pilot and feasibility trials with some colleagues in the UK. And to be honest, we were very deliberate in discouraging reporting of p-values when people report pilot and feasibility trials, because they're not designed for statistical significance in the first place, right? Some people have encouraged focusing more on clinical relevance instead of statistical significance. When we design studies, we often have the minimum clinically important difference that we use as part of the design to determine how much information to collect. But when we interpret the results, we often actually forget about it. So perhaps we can now bring it back in the interpretation and see where it falls relative to the confidence interval that you're obtaining from a study. Whether, it gives you definite clinical importance, probable, and so on. So bringing back that minimum clinically important difference in the interpretation could perhaps help. Just wanted to remind you that this concept of clinically important difference actually is not new. It came out in, I think it was 1988 from some of my colleagues here at McMaster. Gordon Guyard was one of them. Perhaps we should consider abandoning p-value threshold and use of statistical significance. And in his editorial, Don actually recommended a whole set of measures, including perhaps if we report p-values, let's abandon the thresholds. There have been others that have said, well, maybe we should lower the threshold. We saw that that's not a panacea, right? Perhaps we could actually adopt other Bayesian methods of doing analysis, such as Bayesian statistics, and focus more on capturing uncertainty and so on. And if none of these things really work, perhaps we should reconsider how we train people and take everybody back for training, right? Others have recommended considering other dimensions of clinical importance or relevance. Patient importance has been one of those measures that others have recommended. Person significance has been advocated by others. Patient-centeredness, patient orientation. And here in Canada, we've actually had the whole movement of trying to actually encourage people having research that a lot more patient-oriented and so on. And Tito also brought in another concept which he thought humanly important effects. And if you really want to read more about it, you can have a read at it in this textbook. My final thoughts is that statistical thinking is really about evidence-based thinking, how we consume information to make better decisions. And certainly all aspects of how we collect that information, how we actually synthesize it, and how we then apply it in practice, including communication. It's absolutely essential. We don't need statistical significance to think statistically, right? But one could argue that, however, we need clinical relevance to be evidence-based. And ideally, in this quadrant, if something is not statistically significant and is certainly not clinically important, one would argue that perhaps it may not be that useful. However, even if it's not statistically significant, but it's clinically important, there may still be utility, because quite often we never have enough resources for very large studies that could yield statistical significance. However, something, if it's not clinically important, even if it's statistically significant, the issue is how good is it? This is where you really want to be. But how often do we have studies falling in that top quadrant? I would suggest that perhaps we need to shift away from this binary thinking of statistical significance and perhaps focus more on education, right? We need to educate people more about critical thinking, statistical thinking, epidemiological concepts, and the fundamental pieces of how to actually do research better. A lot of the things that have been shown to be associated with distortions of treatment effects, they're all methodological in nature, and perhaps doing a much better job training people about all those potential risks for bias would be helpful, including how people should do a better job reporting research. The entire process of peer review needs to be overhauled. We have people who are hired to be editors of journals who, in many ways, are not trained to be, good editors. People learn on the job. Just because you're a good researcher, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a good editor. Certainly, just because you're a good researcher, doesn't mean you're going to be a good reviewer. So the whole peer review system needs to be overhauled. Certainly, one would argue that there's nothing that we do as human beings that's perfect. And therefore, a balanced interpretation for how we report results is essential. So certainly, how we practice evidence-based medicine is essential. Lots of the evidence that we rely on has been shown to work in ideal settings. But quite often when we go to routine settings, we don't have enough to support what we do. Perhaps that's where more evidence needs to be, and people need to be educated about the importance of doing that. But we need to do a lot better also educating, the press about how to cover science. Certainly, I would say there's a lot more we need to do. So who should we educate? Journal editors and reviewers. We certainly need to educate the lay press about what we do. Lots of researchers, everybody's trying to do good. But sometimes people don't know what they don't know, right? The care providers, who are usually the frontline users of the evidence to provide care, needs more education about how to be cautious when they take the evidence. We certainly need to educate the public so they could have informed discussions. We now seen with this pandemic that statistical thinking is required by every citizen. You don't just have to be an academic or a researcher to be able to help protect the nation. Everybody is expected to behave in ways where they can consume information better for our own protection. Administrators in academic institutions, they need to be educated about the importance of having incentives that are pro-science instead of actually things that actually make science worse, because they don't encourage good behavior for science. And even those who fund research, we really need to educate them about how they need to provide better incentives for good science. All right, so this discussion continues. And the American Statistical Association, they came back and wrote an updated statement about this, warning people that p-values should not be abandoned. Their original statement was not encouraging people to abandon p-values, but rather to use them wisely. Now, the tragedy of poor research, which focuses mostly on this misguided use of p-values, can have terrible consequences for health, particularly for public health. And I'll show you an example, right? People are aware of the controversy between measles and the vaccine for measles. This controversy is not new. Before COVID, these were the headlines in Canada about measles outbreaks in various communities in the country. Where did the controversy come from? It started with a 1998 paper that was published in The Lancet. The paper was later retracted And you'll still find it on the web with a red mark in the middle, retracted. However, I'll show you that the damage that this paper did remains today. What did the paper claim? It claimed that there was a causal link between receiving the vaccine and development of autism in children. I don't need to go into the details of what autism is because you guys are clinicians, you probably know what this condition entails. But I have to say there was overwhelming evidence to the contrary of what the paper was claiming. There was a systematic review after systematic review, all showing that exposure to the vaccine was unlikely to be associated with autism. What did the study look like? It was a small study with 12 participants in it. It was not a randomized controlled trial, although there was a comparator group that I'll come to in a minute. But the conclusions were more speculative than actually supported by the evidence that was presented in the paper. There were other serious ethical issues that, for whatever reason, the journal failed to capture those during the time of the review of the paper. And I would argue that by far, perhaps the most damage that was done by this paper was reporting of p-value of the test of the association between receiving the vaccine and urinary methylmalonic acid, which was used as an outcome. And this outcome was supposedly a proxy outcome for autism, even though there was no evidence to suggest that this is a good surrogate outcome for autism. In the paper, you'll find this graph, and the graph shows the levels of this acid among patients with autism and a small group of other 12 patients who didn't have autism. And you can see that, there's cluster closer to 0 for those who don't have autism, and it's on the increase for those who have autism. And then there was a p-value associated with the association of looking at the difference in the levels between the two groups. Now, this is a report in the abstract. You don't find any measure of the association. You don't find the confidence interval of the association. What you find is a p-value in the abstract. Remember I said earlier on, if something is significant, guess what? You're more likely to find the p-value in the abstract. In this particular case, you don't even find anything else other than the p-value. But the seeds of doubt and confusion had already been planted with serious public health consequences. So this was a graph showing the coverage of measles vaccine in the UK. And you can see that before the publication, which was 1998, it was well above 90%. And of course, immediately following the publication, it started dipping all the way until it was below 80%, right? And if you fast forward to 2019, which was just before the pandemic, this was the situation in the US. Now, we're talking about cases of measles being on the comeback in North America, right? It was happening in Canada, and it was also happening in the US, right? So this was December 31st in 2019. I bet very few people were paying attention to this. The CDC was already monitoring, right? But this was happening because of the power of the anti-vaccine movement. And it was fueled by social media, fake news, misinformation, and so on. And funny enough, it was still spared by that study that was retracted, right? Now, if you think the situation in the US was bad, if you go across the Atlantic in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it was actually catastrophic. These were the scenes before COVID, and this was UN, trying to cover the scenes about what was happening in the Congo. That measles were spreading like wildfire, right? And this was in the news. Nobody was paying attention, at least not as much, because you didn't see much of this in the news, right? Now, you have to think about the damage that this was doing in that region versus what Ebola did, right? Ebola claimed about 21 lives during its peak in West Africa. But by January of 2020, over 6,000 kids had died. We're not talking about cases. In the US, we're talking about cases. Here, we're talking about deaths, right? They had died from measles, right? Now, let me be very fair and be very clear. I'm not suggesting that this is happening because of p-values. The reality is a lot of this was happening because of lack of resources and limited access to care in the Democratic Republic of Congo. However, what I'm suggesting is we were focusing a lot of our efforts in North America in fighting misinformation and false and fake news about the vaccine, many of which were fueled by a study that was retracted. We could be using all those resources to be helping this country, right? Perhaps they would have a much better chance if they got all the help with us redirecting the resources to help them. So certainly, my argument is we could actually be using, but all these things were happening at the time where nobody ever thought we were living in an era where something that was debunked and retracted could actually come back and still be part of this. How do I know this is still part of this? Because the CBC actually had a marketplace program that had a story on anti-vaccination movement. And in that story, they actually showed that the movement was still very strong. And guess who was in the middle of it? The primary author of that paper, he was still the darling of this anti-vaccination movement. And that's not surprising. You know, if the pharmaceutical industry, to some extent, have created this perception that they're not transparent, they're bad for behavior because they're interested in profits and so on, and they're willing to kill to get there. And of course, if somebody suggests that they're killing children, guess what? People are not going to want their children to be killed by a pharmaceutical industry. So it's an easy thing to actually say, guess what? They're trying to suppress us by retracting our manuscript because we are trying to tell the whole world they're killing children with the vaccine. So people were paying attention to that message because it's about kids and everybody wants to protect kids, right? So it's not surprising that people are paying attention to it. So we wrote a story about, all these issues, looking at the debate and so on. And our message is really trying to encourage, perhaps, instead of getting rid of it, maybe we could de-emphasize the focus, but focus more on really training all the key stakeholders for better science. Statistical significance is certainly not the same as all these other dimensions of importance, which perhaps we could figure out how to emphasize them more and de-emphasize statistical significance. So the whole push of trying to get rid of it, there's reasons behind it, but I'm not sure whether it's really going to solve the problem, to be honest. We've always advocated for people to focus more on confidence intervals when they interpret information. But perhaps we need to do a much better job. Who should we educate? Encourage, educating all the key stakeholders. I'm not sure whether we'll succeed. There's a YouTube video for this, but we also videotaped this if you're interested to continue to have a look at it. I say thank you to you guys, and hopefully this was helpful. I'll stop sharing my slides and we can have some discussions. I will. I can see you're upside down. You're muted.
Yeah, no, thank you for I think the really robust discussion. I mean, I know it's a robust discussion. I do think this is really, it's really important. And when we design trials, we have to be thoughtful in terms of how they are sized. And sometimes we don't have enough resources to do larger trials. And that really puts us into a tough spot because so many trials are probably undersized, under-resourced, and thus lead to neutral results on statistical hypothesis tests. And I thought that the quote, the evidence of absence is not absence of evidence is extremely important when considering this. And typically when I review grants or papers, I'm very, I think this needs to be sort of put in the context of we should be publishing neutral research too.
Yes.
But when neutral research is sort of used excessively to sort of make a point that there's absence of evidence, then I think it's I think it's a problem. I think the other thing that I think is somewhat interesting it's sort of near and dear to a disease that I study, is when you start to do a variety of meta-analysis and you enter in more noise because you have more studies and you have more heterogeneity, you really know that you're going to be widening the confidence interval. So it's almost a foregone conclusion at some point, unless it's something that has a huge effect size, you're going to overlap that confidence interval with unity at some point. And I think there are some out there who are like, once the confidence that you have a bunch of evidence, a bunch of positive clinical trials, so other clinical trials come by, they're less of a big estimate of treatment effect, or maybe a neutral effect. Those are mixed in, and then all of a sudden a little bit of the confidence interval starts to go over unity from that whole body of evidence, and then people are like, oh, there's no evidence it works now. It's like, it doesn't, just because you sort of flipped, similar, like, it's the evidence isn't as strong. And I think I think the other sort of, the underlying issue is in that for things that are binary outcomes, like survival, for example, it's really hard to come up with a minimally clinically significant difference. For most diseases, if you're that 1% more people who live with a disease, that's pretty meaningful. But to study that and say, in a stroke trial would require, to find that sort of effect size would require a really, really large amount of patients. So those are some of my reflections. I don't know if you want to respond to that, and then we have some from the audience here.
To be honest, I'm not sure whether there's anything to respond to well, because you're raising things that we're all struggling with. The issue of minimal clinically important difference is not even just in one area, because even in one area, it's outcome dependent, right? So it is a challenge. And 5 people working in the same area, designing similar trials and so on in that particular area and looking at the same outcome could differ in what they think the minimum clinically important difference is. And it's always an issue of whose perspective anyway, because if I'm a payer, I would have a different perspective to it versus if I'm a patient versus if I'm a clinician, right? So it's not an easy concept to grapple with, certainly when we are trying to use it for designing trials, let alone interpreting it, right? Now, I see a comment in the question and answer of someone is asking. I'll read the question. It says, the fragility index was super interesting. Is there a way to evaluate what the continuous or for ordinary outcomes, right? I think there's a paper that outlines the methods of how to do this for continuous outcomes. I'll see if I can find that paper and send it along. Right? We looked at it for binary outcomes, but I think there's a paper that looks at it for continuous outcomes.
Yeah, I think at a very sort of top level sort of conceptual idea, the thing that's a little tricky is that you have both the, how much would the mean and variance need to change? Because it's like there's 2 things that potentially can be moving in the same direction or in different directions that would influence that.
Absolutely.
So it's trickier, and it's just a little harder to wrap your head around, I think, in that. Yeah. But you could give up frequentness and just become a Bayesian and just be like, yeah, there's a 91% probability of this difference.
Of
this, there's a 90% posterior that there is a 5% or greater treatment effect. But then it has its own problems, right? Because we don't know how sure do we need to be for a disease, and obviously regulators, at least here in the United States, are really, find that 0.025 false positive rate to be quite something they cling to quite dearly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's another comment. No, I don't have any other comment.
I think it was just that Dr. Kerr thanking you for the response. So
okay, all right.
We'll say we got it answered.
Well, so we have about 3 minutes left. I don't see any other comments. I would say First, I have to apologize that, we tried this a few times in the past. We couldn't do it because of technical problems. But I'm glad we were able to do it for this.
It's very
Okay.
kind of you to apologize, but that's I need to apologize to you and to the folks who've joined, because those were errors on my part. But I thank you so much for your patience and particularly perseverance.
Oh, not a problem. Not a problem at all. I mean, I felt bad because we're all in this together. Nobody, it wasn't an intentional challenge that was created, but sometimes these glitches happen in every system. Yeah. And just says, thank you guys for inviting me to be part of this. I also find it rewarding to just vent out to my frustrations of how we approach science.
Yeah, no, it's really a blessing that you've been able to kind of talk to this group and our group. And I think with that, we have a nice comment thanking you from Dr. Conwent, one of the other course directors. But I think with that, I think we can adjourn for the day. Michelle, were you going to put the evaluation link in the chat if you haven't already?
Yes, it should be there for everybody.
Oh, you may want to just repost it. For some of us, like me, who joined a minute late, it doesn't show
Okay.
up in the chat if
Sure.
it was posted before you. So if you want to just repost it, and I'm just sort of admitting that I was tardy, but I guess
Sure.
the punctual noticed. But so we'll leave the meeting open a second so that link comes up. But certainly, if you got the link in the chat already and you fill out the evaluation, definitely feel free to sign off. And again, Dr. Thabane, always a pleasure to hear from you. And again, thank you so much for presenting.
Thanks, Will. And thanks, Michelle, for all your help.
Thank you, Dr. Thabane. Appreciate it.
Okay. Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.